Dune works a little bit like Game of Thrones. In this video, I'll explain Dune Part 1. Who are the characters, what are they doing, and what is Dune really all about? Oh yeah, and how come Duncan Idaho shaves his face halfway through the film and is clean shaven all of a sudden? I'll explain that too. My name is Jay Sherer. I'm a screenwriter, producer, and recently a first-time director. Dune Part 1 introduces us to 4 different groups of people, all of which are essential to understand if you want to grasp what's happening in the film. Let's start with House Atreides. House Atreides is led by Duke Leto Atreides, who's played here by Oscar Isaac. Leto's goal is to rule justly and build a solid state. He's married to Lady Jessica, played by Rebecca Ferguson, who's a member of the Bene Gesserit. More on that later. Leto and Jessica have a son named Paul, who's the main character of Dune. Duncan Idaho, played by Jason Momoa, is one of the military leaders and an advisor to Leto. Gurney Halleck, who's played by Josh Brolin, has a very similar role to Duncan Idaho. He's also involved in the military, and he's also an advisor to Leto. Thorfinn Hawat is a third advisor who's sort of like a human computer. Think of Data from Star Trek or Lobot from Star Wars, which, by the way, in the world of Dune, according to the screenplay, this kind of character, this sort of robot human kind of character, is called a Mentat. Thorfinn Hawat is played by Stephen McKinley Henderson. And rounding out House Atreides, we have Dr. Wellington Yueh, who's essentially a medical doctor for House Atreides. House Atreides resides on the planet of Caladan, which is ruled over ultimately by the Emperor. And all these different houses are all under the Emperor's umbrella. Now, Leto Atreides' goal is to be a strong, capable leader who works for the good of the universe. Leto is a cool guy. That's why I kind of compare him to Eddard Stark in some ways. Lady Jessica, as I mentioned, is a member of the Bene Gesserit, which is a religious sect of women who possess paranormal abilities. It's not clear what all of those abilities are, but they seem to include the ability to predict the future and the ability to mind control people using the voice. Lady Jessica wants to support her husband, but she also believes in the prophecy of Kwisatz Haderach. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right at all, who is known as the One, like Neo from The Matrix, or as like a messiah figure. Though we never hear what the prophecy is exactly, it basically revolves around a male who has the power of the Bene Gesserit. Lady Jessica believes that her son Paul might be the Kwisatz Haderach. In fact, she's actively attempting to make him the One. Now let me pause here to say, I'm giving you all of the info as it's given to us both in the film and the screenplay. I read the book decades ago, but I'm not going to get into that at all. And if you've read the book and you want to let me know more about it, leave me a comment down below. And again, I'm probably not pronouncing any of these names correctly. If you want to let me know about that, leave those down below too. Now, Duncan, Gurney, and Thorfinn, all the advisors of Leto Atreides, they just want to support the goals and objectives of Leto and House Atreides. To that end, they have one of the best fighting forces in the universe, highly trained and really effective. Which brings us to a little bit more detail about the final member of House Atreides, Paul, the main character of Dune, like I referenced before. And like many of the stories from early sci-fi and fantasy masterpieces, Paul Atreides feels like he's on the hero's journey. He needs to find himself, overcome adversity, and then rise up to his destiny. More on that later. But let's get into our second house, House Harkonnen. House Harkonnen is led by Lord Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, who's played by Stellan Skarsgård. His main aide in running House Harkonnen is Rabban Harkonnen, who's played by Dave Bautista, who you probably know as Drax from Guardians of the Galaxy. Rabban, who's called the Beast in the screenplay, is Vladimir's nephew and the leader of the Harkonnen army. Baron Harkonnen's primary objective is to make money. All indications point to Vladimir being a glutton in every sense of the word. And Rabban's goal is to help his uncle be as powerful and influential as possible. House Harkonnen also has a Mentat, Piter de Vries, and he's played by David Dastmalchian, who you might recognize as Polka Dot Man from the Suicide Squad, but he's also been in a bunch of other stuff. Now, while House Atreides and Caladan feel like places you'd want to live, or people you'd want to live under if they were ruling the area, House Harkonnen, rulers over the planet Gaidi Prime, feels like a place you would definitely want to avoid. It does not seem cool at all, and the Baron seems absolutely atrocious. Now, if House Atreides, like I mentioned before, is the equivalent of House Stark from Game of Thrones, then House Harkonnen is like House Bolton, and like Ramsay Bolton being the leader. They're just the worst. I would have labeled them House Lannister, but honestly, it kind of feels like House Lannister might be the Emperor. We'll have to wait to part 2 to see the Emperor and actually how the Emperor is portrayed. But you can kind of see all of these houses like kind of jockeying for position amongst each other, which is why I feel like it's a little bit like Game of Thrones. House Atreides and House Harkonnen both fall under the rule of the Emperor, who we actually don't see in Dune Part 1, but we do know we're going to see him in Dune Part 2. The Emperor controls all of the Imperium and all of its resources, and we don't really know much more than that. Also working under the Emperor, although she has some of her own designs on what should happen, is the Reverend Mother of the Bene Gesserit, and her goal is to influence universal politics via religious outreach. We don't quite know if she's good or bad, but she's certainly willing to play both sides as needed. And she's like the creepiest nun of all time, at least in the sci-fi universe. And that brings us to our final people group, the Fremen. The Fremen are a desert people who reside on the planet of Arrakis. They have a more tribal, almost nomadic feeling lifestyle. And the Fremen we meet in part 1 are Dr. Liet Kynes, played by Sharon Duncan Brewster. She's the judge of change appointed by the Emperor to make sure that the spice harvesting is handed off from House Harkonnen to House Atreides efficiently. There's also Stilgar, who's a leader of a Seich, or a community of Fremen. He's played by Javier Bardem. We also see Yamis, played by Babs Olusanmoken, which I'm sure I'm pronouncing wrong. And finally, Chani, who's played by Zendaya. The Fremen are not interested in politics or the Imperium. They just want to be left alone, but there's one giant problem, and this is the overarching plot of Dune Part 1. The desert of Arrakis is full of spice, and spice is a hallucinogenic, powder-like substance that has a very critical purpose. It allows spaceships to traverse the universe or the galaxy. Not as a fuel source, per se, but it's more like a mind-altering drug that's used by the ship's navigators to plot routes between planets. So my understanding is that spice allows navigators to act as like remote viewers who can navigate ships safely across the universe. We never see that happen, but that's what it sounds like based on some of the things that we learn in the screenplay and in the film. Now, as you can imagine, all commerce in the universe requires spice for trade because they've got to get these ships across the galaxy. And that makes spice insanely valuable. And that brings us to the core plot of Dune Part 1. House Harkonnen has been in control of Arrakis for 80 years, and they make bank. They make a lot of money. They earn a ton of money from harvesting spice and distributing it across the universe. It is one of the most core resources in the universe, so therefore they make a lot of money off of it. And they're in charge of harvesting it here on Arrakis. Now, the Fremen on Arrakis hate House Harkonnen because House Harkonnen only cares about the spice, not them. And the Fremen, as we see in basically the opening scene, consistently attack spice harvesters to disrupt Harkonnen operations. But here's another thing, spice is also seen as an important spiritual resource to the Fremen. And since they grow up around it, the spice actually makes their eyes glow blue. So when you see like the glowing blue eyes, it's being around the spice that is causing that glow of blue eyes. At the beginning of the story, the Emperor decrees that House Harkonnen must turn over spice harvesting operations to House Atreides. House Harkonnen has to abandon Arrakis and let House Atreides take over. The central conflict of the plot is House Atreides has to rule Arrakis and supply the universe with spice, and Leto wants to do that in a healthy, positive way. But House Harkonnen, as you might imagine, is pissed because they just lost a ton of revenue potential. And as I said before, Baron Harkonnen is a glutton and he's all about that money, so he is not happy about this. But we learn something else as the story goes along. The Emperor is actually jealous of House Atreides and potentially worried that House Atreides is becoming too strong under Leto's amazing leadership. So the Emperor purposely handed Arrakis over to House Atreides so that it would justify a war between House Atreides and House Harkonnen. thereby weakening House Atreides. Basically, Leto's too cool of a guy. The Emperor is wondering if maybe one day Leto could actually make a play for the overall throne of the universe, and he doesn't want that to happen, so he's got to bring House Atreides down and potentially get rid of Leto. That's why Baron Harkonnen describes House Atreides being given control of Arrakis in this way. When is a gift not a gift? The transference of power is all a big plot to weaken House Atreides. It's not a gift at all. It's actually something that they're using to screw them over. So that's the overall plot. We're talking about a resource-rich world being fought over by two houses, both of which are underneath the overarching rule of the Emperor. And by the way, Baron Harkonnen and Leto Atreides are actually cousins. So these people are like sort of related to one another. At least they call each other cousin. And that's mostly in the screenplay, although I did think he says it once in the film, if I'm not mistaken. Now, weaved into this main plot is the story of Paul Atreides. Paul is a male who's trained in the ways of the Bene Gesserit by Lady Jessica, his mom. Paul has to decide what his destiny is going to be. And as with Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, Paul's destiny appears to be a core part of the future of the universe itself. Paul has dreams where he sees potential futures, but those dreams don't always come true. So here are some of the things that Paul actually dreams about throughout the film. He dreams that Duncan Idaho will be killed on Arrakis. He dreams that Paul will join the Fremen and learn their ways. He dreams that Chani will turn on him and stab him. He dreams that his mother will have another child, that she's pregnant. And he dreams that he'll die, not just from Chani, but also related to a fight he's going to have later with Jamis. And then there's a hint in this film that maybe he's supposed to die, although that's unclear. So maybe the Bene Gesserit expect him to die because maybe the Messiah rises again or something along those lines. Those things are kind of left mysterious to us, and we're not supposed to understand them completely. Now, some of Paul's dreams come true, and then some of his dreams don't come true. And here's why, at least in my opinion. Paul, despite the prophecies foretold about him, still seems to retain the ability to alter his own destiny. His dream about Duncan Idaho comes true. Duncan dies exactly as Paul dreamed it. Oh, and by the way, in the screenplay, he tells Duncan that he saw him dead with a shaved face, because if you notice at the beginning of the film, Duncan Idaho has a really big beard like Jason Momoa normally has. But later on, he has shaved his beard. Well, when Paul tells Duncan that he's going to die with a shaved face, Duncan basically says, that'll never come true because I'm not shaving my beard. Except in the screenplay, there's a scene where Leto forces him to shave his beard. So if you're wondering why Duncan suddenly shows up later in the film clean shaven, well, it's because that scene was probably cut out of the final film. It's a long film already, so I can see them trying to cut things for space. But the dream was that he was going to die and his face was shaved when he died. And he's like, I'm not going to shave my face, but then he has to. And later on, that dream does come true. But Paul's other dreams don't all come true. He does join the Fremen at the end of the film, but when he sees himself being killed by Jamis, he refuses to let that happen. While the voices in his head almost indicate that he has to die in order to become the Messiah, he goes against those voices and kills Jamis instead of letting Jamis kill him. And that is the central conflict for Paul. What destiny will he live into? The one prescribed to him, or will he forge his own path? He has his father's legacy to grow into being the Duke. He has his mother's legacy growing into being a religious figure, and he has to decide which one he's going to live into, or if his path is already decided for him and destiny will just take him on the path that's prescribed for him. Okay, so let me give a brief overview of how this all plays out, and this will be pretty fast. Paul is having dreams of a girl, Chani, on Arrakis, but he doesn't know her. She's just showing up in his mind, in his dreams. Leto relocates House Atreides from his home planet of Caladan to Arrakis to take over the spice mining operation from House Harkonnen. Upon arrival on Arrakis, Leto attempts to make peace with the Fremen, but before he can attempt to set up operations, House Harkonnen attacks House Atreides on Arrakis. And they win primarily because of two key factors. One, the Emperor secretly aided House Harkonnen by giving them 3 battalions of Sardaukar troops. Sardaukar are skilled soldiers who serve the Emperor. Remember, the Emperor thought House Atreides was becoming too powerful, so all of this changing of the guard on Arrakis is just a ploy to weaken House Atreides and bring House Harkonnen back in to take over the spies operations and have Leto either killed or taken down a notch. But also, Dr. Wellington Yueh, the physician of House Atreides, betrays his own house. It turns out that the doctor's wife was being held hostage by House Harkonnen. In order to save his wife, Dr. Yueh betrays House Atreides by shutting down their defenses. Now, Dr. Yueh isn't all bad. He does give Leto a device that allows him to poison Vladimir Harkonnen before he dies. Unfortunately, the device does hurt Baron Harkonnen, but it doesn't kill him. After this giant battle, House Harkonnen regains control of Arrakis. It's pretty much a rout. But Duncan, Jessica, and Paul all manage to escape during the attack, and they head for the desert to try and connect with the Fremen. Duncan Idaho saves Paul and Jessica by fighting off a squad of Sardaukar troops and dies the way Paul saw in his dream. So Paul's dream was correct. He did die fighting all of the Sardaukar troops. Jessica and Paul, helped by Dr. Kynes, reach the desert and find the Fremen, led by Stilgar, the leader that Paul met earlier in the film. This is where Paul meets Chani for the first time. And in the last sequence of the film, Paul has to fight one Fremen soldier, Jamis, to death in order to be accepted into their group, to become a Fremen. Paul hears voices that seem to suggest that he should let Jamis kill him so that he can become the Kwisatz Haderach. But Paul kills Jamis instead. Again, is Paul going to walk the destiny that some religious organization has prescribed for him, or is he going to define his own journey? That still remains to be seen. Paul Atreides might be the one, but we're not sure. The Reverend Mother, leader of the Bene Gesserit, noted earlier in the film that they're monitoring others who also might be the one. Dune Part 1 ends with Paul being accepted into the Fremen, and he meets Chani, literally the girl of his dreams from even the opening sequence of the film. So the questions that remain for Dune Part 2 are, will Paul rally the rest of the universe together to overcome the Emperor? Is that his destiny? Is Paul the one? What do the Fremen and Chani have to do with Paul's journey? Those are all interesting questions we'll get answers to in Dune Part 2. Did I miss anything? Did you have any additional questions I didn't cover? Leave questions and comments down below. If you want to explore the structure of Dune Part 1 in a little bit more detail and see what Paul's character journey has looked like thus far, make sure you're subscribed for my next video. Thanks for watching.